Hi everyone. Welcome to this lecture from me, Marty Brannigan, the convener of Peace Studies. Just going to get the screen shared. Peace Studies is about to celebrate 40 years at UNE, making it one of the oldest peace studies centres in the world. In December, we're going to be holding a major international conference with plenty of art, music, performances, films and field trips. So you're all welcome to attend or tune into the Zoom sessions. We're doing it virtually and in person. So today, I'm going to be talking about the issue of nuclear weapons, which is the ultimate manifestation of human violence towards each other and the environment. But as this is a foundational humanities unit, I want to cover a few other things. So I'll give you an overview of the Peace Studies discipline and, of course, encourage you to enrol in some of our units once you learn about how diverse and critically important Peace Studies is. Because peace is vital for the well-being of societies from individual and community levels right up to national and international levels. To give just one example, it's almost impossible to run a university or study within a war zone, such as we currently see in Ukraine. Today marks 6 months since the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and it's also Ukrainian National Independence Day, when they got their independence from the USSR. We often take peace for granted, but Russia's invasion shows how fragile it can be, particularly if we continue to subscribe to militaristic societies. In our units, we explore what a society and the international community can do to effectively resist such aggression through non-violent means, thereby resolving the conflict without adding more violence to the world, and further enriching arms corporations, which are one of the root causes of such wars. Just as importantly, we show how nations and regions can be transformed into more peaceful zones without arms races and ever-escalating threats, such as we see in the rhetoric at the moment between China and the US and allies such as Australia. But I'll also put the discipline within the context of an issue that is very much central to peace studies, and that's the issue of nuclear weapons. So we'll look at some of the ways in which peace studies scholars have approached this issue and go through some key concepts as they apply to this controversial issue. So I'm happy to answer questions at the end, but also if you've got any burning questions while I'm speaking, then jump in. So firstly, what is peace studies? We often hear when we're asked what we do, peace studies, people can't quite believe it. They can't get their head around the idea of studying peace. In terms of humanities disciplines, there's only a handful of peace studies or peace and conflict studies departments in Australia, but there's a fairly big international network of peace studies, and Costa Rica has its own University of Peace, which is UN mandated, known as UPeace. So Peace Studies examines the causes of conflict, including armed war, and suggests solutions. We go into post-conflict rehabilitation, conflict transformation, peacekeeping, peacemaking, and peace cultivation methods, and these include non-violence and activism, intervention, self-autonomy, and alternative governance models. Some of our other Peace Studies units involve national security, and increasingly, we're looking at environmental security and environmental peace. We deal with sustainability, social justice, global justice, and whole earth thinking, and building peaceful and just systems and societies. So I'll go into the reasons why we have such a broad range of subjects in a moment. We examine different types of violence, such as direct, structural, cultural, and ecological. And the discipline is solutions-oriented, aiming to find ways of minimising all forms of violence. It seeks methods of transforming inherently violent structures and institutions with an aim to cultivate positive peace. I'll put this PowerPoint up on the site incidentally, so you can refer to it later. This is the Galtung triangle of violence. So when people think of violence, they generally only think of the top thing, direct violence, which is armed conflict, war, murders, terrorism, assaults, so physical violence, the really obvious stuff that gets in the news. But there's also underlying this less visible violence, like structural violence. So this, for example, would mean where a country is actually exporting food, people are starving within that country. So the system is causing physical violence on people. There's also something called cultural violence. So that's anything in a culture that can support direct violence or structural violence. So racist songs, for example, sexist songs or movies, violent film movies. All of these can contribute to direct violence. So it's important to understand these because not that many people actually die from direct violence compared with how many people die from structural violence. Much greater numbers. And in fact, the numbers of people dying from direct violence continue to drop, contrary to what most people believe. So conflict in itself isn't bad. In fact, it's both normal and inevitable. Whenever you've got two or more people together, they'll naturally have disagreements, whether it's over Vegemite being terrible or the possibility of rapid climate action. But what is problematic is untransformed conflict that escalates into violence. So some other key peace studies concepts are intergenerational justice, interspecies justice, positive and negative peace, and holistic thinking. So I'll just expand briefly on positive and negative peace. Negative peace is something that occurs at the end of a war, when there's a ceasefire and people think, okay, we've achieved peace in this particular country, we don't need to worry too much more about it. But if you don't transform the underlying systems and processes and cultures that are leading to that armed violence, it's going to keep recurring. So positive peace, as opposed to negative peace, is as the system moves towards deeply embedding peace into its institutions and cultures and processes. So we've got a range of units available. We've lost a couple in the last couple of years as neoliberal globalisation and corporatisation of our unis kicks in. But we still have some very important units, which you can see there in the PowerPoint. So let's have a look at violence. I'll come back to that slide. Let's have a look at violence and why we allow its use in systematic and callous ways. Because most of our societies have the ability to have these two irreconcilable attitudes towards violence. So when you go to preschool and kindergarten and early primary school, you're taught not to hit each other, to resolve your issues. It's embedded in our school system these days. No longer are people strapped or all sorts of corporate punishment that used to occur. On the other hand, we allow massively equipped, very, very large armies and air forces and navies to go out and kill people that they've never met, often on the orders of unelected superiors. And some of the people directing them are very damaged. If you look into the history of Stalin or Hitler, very, very damaged people from their childhood onwards. But not all nations subscribe to this. So there are countries like Costa Rica that has that University of Peace that have no armed forces, and they haven't for about 70 years. Now, there's often a ticking bomb argument where it said, well, surely we need violence if my mother's about to be killed or my sister is about to be raped. And of course, these are very problematic, but they're extreme examples. And in terms of a lot of the violent conflict that goes on, there are often alternatives. Ukraine, for example, had two almost entirely non-violent revolutions in 2004 and 2014, where they got rid of pro-Russian governments in Ukraine. In Finland, they used non-violence in 1989 to resist USSR and Russian forces. They'd tried violence for decades and then from 1980 used non-violence and had success within 10 years. Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia, these are all countries around Russia. They all resisted the USSR. And at one point in 1989, there were about 2 million people holding hands across all three countries, demanding nuclear disarmament and independence. And by the early 1990s, with almost no violence, all three of those nations had secured their independence from the USSR. And that's no mean feat because the USSR was one of the most repressive and heavily armed empires in history. Violence didn't succeed against them, non-violence did. And I'll come back to that point. Now, every situation is different and complex, making comparisons problematic. But it's worth examining the death tolls of two fairly similar struggles, both being anti-colonialist struggles of third world countries versus first world Western European ones in the mid-20th century. So Algeria had a mainly violent insurrection in the first years, at any rate, against France. And 1 million people died from war-related causes. If we compare that with what happened in India, it's largely non-violent struggle against a more powerful opposition in Britain had a death toll of a few thousand at most. And according to a 2010 film, Hors la loi, or Outside the Law, the later phase of the Algerian campaign, open non-violent resistance in the streets and subways of Paris, creation of parallel institutions or alternative institutions, and international pressure did more to gain them independence than a long and bloody terrorist campaign that achieved very little while dehumanising all the participants in it. If we move on to another example, it's often said that non-violence wouldn't have succeeded against Nazism. Barack Obama has said that. Ken Beazley, the former foreign minister for Australia, or defence minister for Australia, a range of people keep repeating this. But one non-violent technique which could be used more is that of economic boycotts, sanctions and divestment, or BDS, it's often known as, such as against the numerous foreign or international corporations that supported Nazism. In some cases, supplying war material to both the Nazis and the Allies. So these are some of the very well-known names of corporations who supplied either Germany or both Germany and their allies. So Standard Oil was financed by the Union Banking Corporation and it supplied fuel for the Nazi warplanes, part owned and armed by ITT, the International Telegraph and Telephone Company, that was also involved in the overthrow of the democratically elected government in Chile. So other financiers included the Chase Bank, Allianz, Kodak, and Nestlé's, while Ford built almost half of the Nazis' 350,000 trucks, and they repaired them in supposedly neutral Switzerland. Adolf Hitler said, "I regard Henry Ford as my inspiration." And Henry Ford received the Grand Cross of the German Eagle from Nazi Germany in 1938. General Motors was also involved in building armoured planes, cars and tanks for the Nazis. And initially they refused to build anything for the Allies, even though they were based in the USA. So this is the fastest plane around, which the Germans were using, and it was built by General Motors. IBM developed punch card machines, and they were essential for the Nazis' cataloguing and dispatching of their millions of victims in the Holocaust. As shown in this satirical poster. BMW and Shell both used forced labour. You might have heard something on the news today about forced labour still occurring in Southeast Asia for corporations like Ansell, sell rubber products in Australia. Coca-Cola sold to both sides of the conflict. They developed Fanta when they couldn't get Coke in Germany. So non-violent action would have struggled to stop the Nazi bombers when they were on the way to bomb London, but military methods also struggled. And boycotts and divestments and sanctions could have stopped those planes from being financed, from being built, from being supplied and armed in the first place. And you could ask, what if the Allies had used the $1.5 trillion that they were still paying off to the US only a decade or so ago? Instead of spending it on military action, if they spent that on coordinated international non-violence, targeting the economic pillars of Nazism and using a lot of other different strategies and tactics in a coordinated way. And this is something which happened in the overthrow of the apartheid regime in South Africa. There was an international campaign of boycotts, sanctions and divestments that was very successful against Coca-Cola, the same corporation involved in Nazism. And a range of other similar corporations like General Motors and Ford. And eventually, as Jeff Harris writes, one of the initiators of peace studies, the South African regime had to come to the bargaining table because they were virtually broke. No one in the world would deal with them anymore while they were continuing with the apartheid regime. You understand what apartheid refers to? It's a very racist system that happened in South Africa where black or coloured people or Indian people were all in lower tiers to the white people descended from Dutch and British stock. So very, very racist, very violent, very repressive, and yet it was overthrown primarily through non-violence. In fact, some people argue that the violence that was used by some of the people there was counterproductive and slowed down the success of the non-violence. So a thorough understanding of non-violent action and its histories and successes and potential is one of the lenses or perspectives that we bring to an issue such as nuclear weaponry. So in academia, we need to present evidence-based arguments, but the evidence-based arguments that we use are sometimes quite surprising and counterintuitive. One study, for example, by a former military staffer, Erica Chenoweth, who was initially sceptical about non-violence, found that in 300 efforts to depose governments over the last century, non-violent revolutions were more than twice as likely to succeed as violent ones. They also led to better governments in the end because they didn't need that secrecy, they didn't use that violence, they weren't as corrupt. There were a range of other findings, such as they actually worked faster too, which is another surprising finding. So the common perception that violence is necessary against violent opponents, fighting fire with fire, is problematic. It's just that, it's a perception. It's widely held, but it's not based on evidence. Whereas a common sense approach would suggest that you fight fire, not with fire, but with water. That is, use a completely different approach that continues to wrong foot your opponent and maintain the moral high ground. Now, academia is also expected to avoid bias, but peace studies is quite different in this respect, as we bring a normative bias to our approach, which is central to our role as peace advocates and scholars and practitioners all rolled into one. And that is that peace is superior to violence. Leading peace studies scholar David Barash argues that it's a discipline that's inherently and unashamedly biased, overtly favouring peace over violent conflict. So we oppose things that create violence and impact on the ability of peace to thrive. And of course, there's complexities and grey areas, such as around what constitutes violence and non-violence. How does sabotage, for example, fit into those conceptions? But there can be no doubt that dropping a 50 megaton nuclear warhead is just about the most violent act that humanity is capable of. It's the logical extension of violent defence. Mutually assured destruction, which is aptly acronymed MAD, M-A-D. It threatens the survival of all humanity and the planet with all its species. It's anthropocentricity maximum, that we can threaten every species because of disputes between humans. Anthropocentricity, you might have come across that term. It just means the belief that humans are at the very top of the hierarchy and can basically do what they like with all other species. Here are the figures from Erica Chenoweth, who worked with Maria Stefan. Major non-violent campaigns achieved success 53% of the time, compared with 26% for violent resistance campaigns. Now, here's a shot of what happened in Hiroshima in 1945. We recently saw the 77th anniversary of this occasion, and Nagasaki, another town in Japan, also had a nuclear bomb dropped on it by the USA. I'll let you read that. Well, no, maybe I'll read it rather than leaving it to you. The truth is that nuclear weapons don't keep the peace, but rather inflame passions of distrust by demonstrating a willingness to utterly destroy another country and annihilate its people. You could ask, what possible moral justification could exist for threatening mass murder as a means of preserving the peace? It's David Krieger speaking. Fortunately, Hiroshima and Nagasaki are the only instances of large-scale nuclear weapons deployed. Although 140,000 were killed at Hiroshima, if we count the initial blast and the fallout, the radiation and the leukemia. So about 46% of leukemia deaths and 11% of cancer deaths among the bomb survivors were due to radiation from those bombs. And their destructive power was unprecedented. They incinerated buildings and people, and they left lifelong scars on the survivors, both physical and psychological, and on the cities themselves. So there was birth defects, impacts on brain development, anxiety in the general population decades later, great losses to infrastructure, and immediately afterwards, prostitution, gang-related crime, suicides, all related to the poverty and starvation generated by the decimation of the city. So fairly heavy stuff. Let's just take a break for a minute. Does anyone know the origin of the peace symbol? No doubt you know what it looks like. It's that circular symbol. Yep. Yeah, okay. Do you know when it came about? Or the peace dove. Peace dove was designed by Pablo Picasso, probably had earlier antecedents in religious symbology. But Picasso designed one for a communist international convention in Russia, and that got adopted about 1946. The peace sign was developed in the 1960s as part of the nuclear disarmament campaign. So it's from the symbols N and D, nuclear disarmament. And that shows how central to peace is the whole nuclear disarmament movement, which we'll go into in a little while. Yep. Someone wanting to talk or? If you want to speak, can we can unmute them or they can unmute? Yeah, if you want to speak, just put your hand up and unmute. Okay, we might come back to your question. But I want to ask now, is there any circumstance in which a peace scholar would argue the case for nuclear weapons? And we'll start with the realist argument, which is covered in the topic notes and readings. And the argument is that nations stockpile weapons for defence. It's to keep a country safe, to keep peace and maintain peace. But as Krieger explains, it's argued by proponents of deterrence theory that nuclear weapons kept the peace throughout the Cold War. The basic argument is that the existence of nuclear arsenals in the US and USSR prevented each side from attacking the other for fear of overwhelming retaliation. But Krieger goes on to argue that US nuclear weapons didn't prevent a war with North Korea, nor with China when the US crossed its border in the Korean War. And nor did US nuclear weapons prevent a war with Vietnam, where incidentally, many more people died than more recently in the long-term occupation of Afghanistan. One of the many signs that wars are becoming less lethal overall, despite the increase in the lethal nature of the weapons. The same can be said about the war of the UK against Argentina, or the war of the Soviet Union against Afghanistan, where, incidentally, the US had armed and trained the Taliban to resist the USSR, although the Taliban later used those weapons and training against the US, demonstrating how military violence can backfire and spread. So nuclear weapons neither kept the peace nor gave the nuclear-armed states any significant advantage in the Cold War and their smaller proxy wars that they had all across the globe. So that one of the most common argument that the peace scholars make when countering the so-called realists. The realists believe that violence is an insurmountable part of human nature. And again, that's contrary to the evidence by experts who specifically investigated this question and found that it's simply not true. You can look up online the Seville statement, which was made by neurophysiologists, psychiatrists, psychologists, geneticists and other scientists at a UNESCO conference. And they categorically denied that there's any scientific evidence to support a biological basis for violence. They say it's scientifically incorrect to say that war or any other violent behaviour is genetically programmed into our human nature. And it concluded that, and I quote, "Biology does not condemn humanity to war, and humanity can be freed from the bondage of biological pessimism." The realists also claim that the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki shortened the war and saved many Allied lives. They claim that maintaining nuclear weapons keeps the world in a balance and provides a lot of jobs. They say that the means supposedly justify the ends, that the bombs stopped the war. And that's a very much disputed claim. What's clear, though, is that those bombs mainly targeted civilians. The adults there could be regarded as partly responsible for the war, although civilians had comparatively little power in that very hierarchical society of 1930s, 1940s Japan, and women had even less power than the male civilians. But children and babies could in no way be regarded as responsible for Japan's military and imperial actions. So you have to ask, what possible moral or ethical justification is there to indiscriminately kill tens of thousands of babies and children? Now, although we rarely examine emotional issues in academia, with the exception of some in psychology and psychiatry and more recently in the social scientists, take a moment to think of this in terms of the emotional carnage that this brought to the world. Most people shudder to think of the death of a single baby or child. To contemplate the deaths of tens of thousands is almost unthinkable. And again, you can ask what kind of people could order and carry this out? Or more broadly, what kind of system could lead them to believe that this could ever be okay? Now, outside the Allies, there's a strong case that Hiroshima and Nagasaki's bombings should be regarded as crimes against humanity. War crimes which deserve prosecution at the highest levels of human society. And the fact that they haven't been is an example of what is called victor's justice. So this is where the victor of a war determines what war crimes should be prosecuted. It also demonstrates the post-war power of the US, where its wartime actions are dramatised, romanticised as heroic and beyond scrutiny in many Hollywood movies, which incidentally often have a very strong backing from the Pentagon. That's one issue we go into in our units, is the connection between the Pentagon and Hollywood, how they continue to promote military violence. Now, these nuclear weapons continue to exist, and their owners need to show that they're prepared to use them, or there's no point in having them. But despite all the horror of those bombs, it's been argued that Hiroshima stands out as the city that has become a leader in positive peace movements. They've got a very significant peace museum there. They're very much the centre of global grassroots nuclear disarmament. They have a peace boat based in Japan, which tours the world. The response straight after the bomb was truly remarkable, and they were clearing debris just hours later. And many of the survivors, or hibakusha, have led the calls by the international peace movement to outlaw nuclear weapons. The first step to do that was the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. So this was opened for signature in 1968, and the treaty entered into force in 1970. After 25 years, the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty parties met in May 1995, and they agreed to extend the treaty indefinitely. So some of the recognised ratifiers of the nuclear weapons state are those nations who possess nuclear weapons and ratified the original agreement. And these include the US, Britain, Russia, and there's a large number of other ratifiers, with Australia being one of these. Recognised nuclear weapon states also include China and France. And 3 of the 4 non-signatories also possess weapons, including Israel, India, and Pakistan, with North Korea having withdrawn in 2003. There have also been threats in recent years to withdraw from Iran and from the US under Donald Trump. And there's been ongoing tensions between India and Pakistan over the contested Kashmir region. And India's defence minister has said that their commitment to the no first use policy would depend on the circumstances. Very recently, US advocates have argued that the AUKUS deal, which Australia is involved with, which would involve Australia obtaining nuclear-powered submarines, also potentially contravenes this treaty. So these are some of the posters that were shown during the Cold War, in some ways normalising the idea of mutually assured destruction, or the idea that societies could survive nuclear war through having fallout shelters. Possibly some people would survive, but it would be a very different planet in order to try and survive in. And children were taught to duck and cover. They were taught these things of getting under their desk if there was a nuclear bomb dropped near them, which would have very little impact on their safety. So children grew up in the shadow of the Cold War. I know when I was at uni, it was amazingly not really a subject taught at Sydney Uni in the early 1980s. Now, I couldn't believe it. Why aren't we dealing with the greatest threat to human society and the planet ever? So a lot of us took on this idea of protest and survive, and we went out and we protested and we protested. But a fearful society is ultimately not a truly peaceful society. There's also enormous environmental damage. So these are the sorts of things we deal with in the environmental peace units, environmental security. And some of this damage occurred in Australia. You might have heard the song Maralinga by Midnight Oil, which is about the British testing their bombs in the desert, not really doing much to protect their own servicemen, primarily men, and doing very little to ensure the safety of Aboriginal traditional owners out there. There's lots of sites across the world, some of the Pacific Islands like Bikini and Mururoa Atoll, all were subjected to nuclear testing. So the peace movements in Australia and elsewhere have often combined concern about nuclear weapons with concerns about the nuclear industry and uranium mining. Australia has one small nuclear reactor, which it uses primarily for medical reasons. We don't have nuclear weapons, but we do have uranium mines in Australia. One of these was stopped by a national and international movement, including a lot of students across Australia, university students, high school students, as well as traditional owners and conservationists and peace activists. So that was a very successful blockade at Jabiluka in the Northern Territory that successfully protected that Aboriginal land. Amazingly, one of the traditional owners on that land, Yvonne Margarula, had been arrested for trespass on her own land. You see some of the people involved in these demonstrations. On your right-hand side is Benny Zabel. He's a guy that's been protesting with this bizarre kind of fairly macabre theatre for most of his life. So probably 45 years he's been doing this on almost no income. Now, the crowning achievement of this movement is that thanks to a more recent campaign, the International Campaign Against Nuclear Weapons, or ICAN, the moral turpitude of nuclear weapons has finally been recognised. So IPAN is based in Melbourne, and yet it's had an international effect. This Australian group campaigned globally for an international ban on nuclear weapons, and they succeeded in getting this through the United Nations, primarily led by women too, I might add. It entered into force on the 22nd of January last year, and 66 nations have now ratified or acceded to the treaty, the most recent one being Malawi in Africa. So the leading proponents of the nuclear weapon ban treaty included Ireland, Austria, Brazil, Indonesia, Mexico, Nigeria, South Africa, and that's pretty significant because they used to have nuclear weapons, but they agreed to get rid of them, and Thailand. So a lot of Africa and South America and the Caribbean are now nuclear weapons-free zones. And many Southeast Asian and Pacific Island nations are also very supportive. Now, Australia hasn't signed up yet, but the ALP committed to signing it if elected. So it's likely that Australia will soon join the global movement if they keep that promise. They might need a little bit of reminding. ICAN, that International Campaign Against Nukes, received the Nobel Peace Prize for its work. And we're delighted to announce that its director, Jem Romold, you can see there with her Nobel Peace Prize, will be speaking at our 40th anniversary conference in December this year. So you're invited to attend or tune into the Zoom sessions, and as I said, and you can contact me for further information, or you can find it on the web. There's a draft program up already and registrations there. It should be a really great 5-day event to celebrate what we do as peace academics, but also celebrate more broadly moves towards positive peace in the community. Now this victory, and I'm into the final straight and almost ready for questions, but the victory in no way means the immediate end of nuclear weapons. So the main nuclear powers will still keep their weapons for now. But it's going to become increasingly difficult for the corporations who make them to get uranium, to get parts, to get servicing or finances. And there's going to be pressure for nations not to deal with nuclear-armed states. As the movement for more ethical investment grows, nuclear weapons companies are going to find themselves as international pariahs at risk of having stranded assets, much as fossil fuel companies are now being forced out of business or made to diversify by boycotts, divestments and sanctions. So nuclear weapons aren't finished yet, but ICAN's victory is an important step forward in the campaign to rid the world of this existential threat to our planet and its inhabitants. I'll stop now for any questions and comments and hope to see you in one of our units and at our conference in December.
I apologize for my voice. I've got a cold, but I was just wondering about the concept of negative peace and the sort of, the sort of nuclear powers. I think these days, some countries, because they have got nuclear power, they can achieve a positive peace because the other countries, they are sort of scared of attacking them, which is sort of, somehow I can probably sort of talk about North Korea. I mean, one of the reasons that North Korea has got so much, emphasis on the sort of nuclear power and things like that is that they claim that they sort of that, having that power protects them from other forces attacking them. I mean, that's their sort of, explanation. And I was interested in finding out your point of view about that.
Yeah, that's a great question, Isabel. I'd just first make a distinction between nuclear power and nuclear weapons. So a lot of countries have nuclear power that don't have nuclear weapons. There is some crossover, of course, because the same corporations, big names like Westinghouse, are often involved in both nuclear power and nuclear weapons. But they are two separate things. Yeah, that's certainly very much the realist argument. That a country like North Korea is safer. It's a fairly short-term argument, though, because in the long term, all weapons that have been developed have eventually been used. North Korea, from what I understand, is a very impoverished country. It's still pumping a huge amount of money into its militaries. And at times they have starvation events there. There simply isn't enough food to support everyone. And this is a little bit like what happened in Russia prior to the collapse of the USSR. They were spending so much of their money on this arms race with the USA that people at home were becoming increasingly dissatisfied with the state of things, but also increasingly concerned about the state of fear that they were constantly living under. And they protested not just within Russia and all those satellite states in the USSR, but right across borders. They reached across to peace activists and environmentalists in other countries in order to get rid of this threat, this existential threat to everyone. That there was this idea that it's better to be dead than red in the US and its allies. But a lot of people resisted that, said, look, this is absurd. Why should we live under this fear of widespread death? And we're not talking just of what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki of 1 or 2 bombs. There's this extraordinary arsenal that we still have globally, which could destroy many, many cities many, many times over. So we have this potential for destruction, which is very scary. And for me, that's not really peace. It might be a form of negative peace, but it's not a sustainable peace.
Thank you.
No worries. I should actually note that there's a different term that's used by Professor Helen Ware. It hasn't been taken up so much yet, but she talks about peace 0 and peace 1 and peace 2 and peace 3 as you progress towards positive peace. She argues that calling a ceasefire negative peace is not really accurate because it's the first step towards a more sustainable peace. Any other questions or comments? Yes, miss. You might have to speak up or use that mic.
Yeah, I'm interested in the question about the investments in nuclear weapons, and I'm interested in what's the profile of people who invest in nuclear weapons? Do they know they're doing that? Do they just, someone with a lot of money just picks the company, puts the money in? So I'm kind of, I'm interested in how much do they know about what they're doing? How intentional is it? And what do you think, what's the potential for changing their minds about what they do? Thanks, Marty.
Yeah, great question, Felicity. And that question will be answered at our conference. So I urge you to come along to that. We're going to be having Jem from ICANN, but also we've got Dr. Sue Wareham, who's the president of the Medical Association for the Prevention of War. She's part of a campaign which is called Quit Nukes, which is all about divesting from nuclear weapons. But as you ask, a lot of people simply aren't aware of what their money is doing. I was on a Zoom meeting with some old school friends yesterday, one of whom used to work for the Commonwealth Bank. And I mentioned that the big 4 banks are all involved in fossil fuel, supporting fossil fuel companies, financing them. But some of them are also involved in nuclear weapons. So the Commonwealth Bank is one of those. They've done a big job around campuses recently, spruiking the Commonwealth Bank, CommBank, CAN. A few people have been resisting that by putting up what the Commonwealth Bank really does. And I think most people simply aren't aware of this. So nukes, I'm pretty sure you can find that online. And there's also a group called Market Forces, which talks about what your bank does, what your super fund does, I recommend Regional Australia Bank and other smaller banks. There's the Bank Australia, I think it's called. They're much more ethical, and there's also very ethical super funds like Future Super. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, so what do you think is the best strategy for getting people to divest? Is it just publicity? Is it just kind of getting the message across to them about which companies are doing that? Yeah, I guess that's, the short term, what's the short term plan for kind of trying to get change?
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's recognising the importance of divestment and boycotts and sanctions. So this is a growing movement. Australia hasn't really caught on so much. It's happening a lot more in Europe. It's happening in the US. But campaigns like Quit Nukes in Australia are pretty effective. Some of the climate campaigners are being fairly effective. In fact, a lot of fossil fuel companies are now complaining that banks are rapidly withdrawing any support for them. So the Adani mine up in Queensland has really struggled to get finance, to get insurance and so on. So it's a growing movement. But again, people have a lot of trust in their institutions and often don't look into what exactly they're doing and what exactly their money's doing. And I noticed this at conferences, sometimes environmental and peace conferences, if I ask how many people have divested, usually you only get a very small percentage. So you get people saying, well, the government should do this, the government should do that, the corporations should do this, but they're not aware that we have power ourselves to influence what's happening in the world. We have a responsibility really to find out what our money's doing, where, you know, when we buy things, when we invest in banks and when we put money in super. No worries. Any final questions or comments? Was there something in the chat? I'm not sure if I can find it. Oh, okay. Well, 6 comments. I might start with the last one. What would you say is the key to world peace? Does anyone else want to jump in there? That's a pretty hard question. But come up and use that. You want to just introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm Lexi. I don't really know if there is a key to world peace, mainly because you're always going to get people who disagree with just for the sake of disagreeing. And so even if you put forward like, you know, a utopia, whereas everything's perfect, it won't be a utopia because there's always going to be people who try and fight what's happening.
For sure. Yeah, great comment. Yeah, I think that goes back to the idea that there's always going to be conflict, but I believe we can evolve and deal with conflict better. And there's a fair bit of evidence that we have been doing that. There's a book by Steven Pinker called Better Angels of Our Nature. And there's a few others around like that talk about how the world is gradually becoming more peaceful, largely due to education, but also UN interventions, peacekeeping missions and so on. And that is informed, again, by academia, by peace scholars, thinking about how to do things better. It's certainly a difficult question, but I would say that we often feel that everything's getting worse and that everything is terrible. And that's true to some degree, but there's also a current going the other way where things are getting better. Things are getting more peaceful. Things are, in some areas, becoming better environmentally, growing back, land care sort of things, more permaculture and restorative farming. And if we look overall at human interactions, most interactions today are peaceful. There's things happening like in Ukraine, which are very terrible and very high profile, but they're not the norm. They're the exception to the majority of our interactions globally. And I see Isabel has put in education and tolerance as her answer to that question. All right, I'll go up the top. How can non-violent actions work in a capitalist world of private non-governmental organisations? Yeah, good question. And that's one reason why I think boycotts and divestments and sanctions are so important in getting corporations to turn around. And, excuse me, they're very concerned. If someone like Greenpeace says, we're going to boycott your company unless you stop this idea of drilling more gas in the North Sea off England, those corporations get very concerned and tend to very quickly abandon those plans. So protests are often against governments and state government authorities, whereas boycotts and divestments and sanctions are really about consumer power. So I'd really urge you to have a look at that Market Forces website and spread that information around. Yep, sanctions during apartheid. Thanks from Joshua. What if the emotional carnage from war forces people to peace? Yeah, that's an interesting question. We do have a number of people in the armed forces who do peace studies. They tend to be very hardworking and very disciplined and organised. And I think some of them are really keen to see alternative ways because they've had to deal with so much terrible stuff in their frontline work. Yeah, I think I'd need to think more about that question. It's a pretty big one. Yeah, peace studies aims towards positive peace. Negative peace is a start, but that's all it is. Yeah, peace studies is, I guess, primarily preventative, and that's probably the best type of medicine as well, trying to prevent people from getting sick or having accidents rather than trying to repair them once they've had whatever it is. But there is a growing number of forces that go into conflict zones and try and deal with it. Peace Brigades International is one. There's something called international accompaniment, and that's in a very repressive or authoritarian regime where small numbers of people go in and accompany someone who might be under threat of being assassinated or disappeared. And they're always in contact with the outside world so that the regime knows that if that person gets bumped off, there's going to be a lot of very unfavourable publicity. So it doesn't guarantee that person's safety, but being surrounded by armed gunmen doesn't necessarily work either, as we saw with the assassination of John F. Kennedy. There's also forces that go in and deliberately try and diffuse a situation en masse. Ukraine has experience of non-violently trying to get rid of a pro-Moscow government. I think it's quite unfortunate that they didn't use all that incredible expertise and experience to resist the Russians in a different way to what they're doing now. It's been 6 months. There's been an enormous number of people killed, huge amount of destruction to the environment there. The only people that are making any money out of it or, any advantage of it are the arms companies. So to me, the more we throw weapons into an already terrible conflict situation, the worse it's going to get. There's a range of different things, including international diplomacy, as well as on the ground non-violent action, which can help transform that situation. Do you want me to keep going, Felicity? Or we're probably running out of time, but that's it. All right. Well, we might wrap it up there, but yeah, you can contact me. You can find me via the UNE website if you have any further questions. Marty Brannigan is my name. Our peace conference is called Environmental and Sustainable Peace. And if you Google that, you can find the website which has a draft program up. Thank you.